Welcome back to Hold Fast, where we have biblical truths for daily battles. My name is Kenny. I'm the host of the podcast, and I'm doing things a little bit differently today in today's episode because for most of the episodes, I have notes written out ahead of time to kind of organize my thoughts because if I don't have notes, a lot of times I can find myself just rambling and going on and chasing rabbits and all those things. But I have a good amount on my mind in regards to this subject, and when we think about our current political climate, there are Christians who have all sorts of responses. You may have clicked on this episode because of the title, wondering what a pastor is going to say about the current political situation, because there's a lot of different directions that can go right now. If you're listening to this episode when it was recorded, we are just, I think, 2 or 3 days out from the attempted assassination on former President Trump. And I was just thinking about that over the weekend, and one of our elders, Nate, did a great job at MissionWay on Sunday, just kind of reminding us to have our speech always be gracious and seasoned with salt, and that the words of our mouths and meditation of our heart be acceptable and pleasing to the Lord in the current political chaos that we're surrounded in. And those are great thoughts. But I was thinking about being a pastor, pastoring MissionWay Church in this season, and recognizing that a lot of times as pastors and Christians in general, we sometimes want to avoid these conversations because we don't want to get too political. And if you know me, you know that I'm not somebody who is very political. We don't want to be thought of as somebody who's divisive. We want everybody to just get along. We want everybody to just kind of lay down their weapons, and calls for peace and unity are great. But at the same time, if that's all we do in situations like this, if the only thing we say is we need to have peace and unity, but we don't actually dig in and try to have a truth and grace-filled conversation about the actual issues at hand, we may be pursuing a false unity. Because we, as Christians especially, we want to be unified around the truth, and we want to be people of the truth. We want to be people of grace and truth. And so we can't only, and we should do this, but we can't only say, hey, everybody, let's try to get along, let's have peace and unity. We need to be a people who promote the truth that unifies. And that's obviously the gospel, but it also, a lot of times, the truths that we proclaim as Christians are going to get into the arena that some people consider political. And so we can't be, if we're going to be faithful Christians, we can't ignore politics. I don't study politics. As somebody who grew up in the Bahamas, I don't fully understand American politics and all that entails. But at the same time, we can't ignore that because politics has so much to do with how we organize our lives, the structure of where we live, and it's legislative morality. You may have heard me say that before, right? So we can't ignore it. And so I just want to give some thoughts. I want to give some comforting thoughts. I want to give some challenging thoughts. And I just kind of want to, as a pastor, just spend a few minutes kind of sharing with you what's been in my heart over the last couple of days, just thinking about this. And I'm sharing this. Let me let you know this as well. The things that I want to share, I'm sharing as the pastor of MissionWay Church in the sense that I want the people of MissionWay and anybody who happens to be listening to this podcast to hear hopefully what comes from my lips and my mouth here is a biblical perspective, a Christ-honoring perspective, a loving, grace-filled, and truthful perspective as well. Because what tends to happen in situations like this, when something really big happens, like this attempted assassination on former President Trump, when something like that happens, a lot of people run to the news outlets and they run to media and they run to political commentators. And I'm not saying it's sinful to do that, but most of those sources are not going to give you biblical worldview thoughts, right? So I want to, as a pastor, make sure that I'm speaking truth and grace into this conversation. What this podcast is not necessarily going to be about, this particular episode, it's not going to be about a political opinion. It's going to be how, as a Christian, do I need to be thinking about and maybe even responding to not just this particular situation of the attempted assassination, but just the tense, angry, full of vitriol political climate that we find ourselves in. And again, I don't have notes, so my thoughts are not necessarily going to be in order of importance per se, but these are just some of the things that I've been thinking through and I want to share. We have to remember, obviously, ultimately, above all of these things, God is still on the throne. And I don't say that as a throwaway statement to say, you know what, Jesus is still on the throne, so none of this matters. Of course it matters. Of course, a situation like this will weigh heavy on our hearts and maybe even stir some anxiety in us and wonder what's going to happen. Where's this going to lead? Is this going to cause more unrest in our country? All these thoughts are going to go through our mind. It does matter. But I say Christ is on the throne to remind us that this has not taken him by surprise like it did us. This does not cause him to be uneasy like it does us. He's still on the throne. He is completely in control. He is the sovereign Lord of the universe, and we have to remember that. We have to remember that in order to find peace and comfort in times like this. So keep that in mind. Remember that as rulers rise and fall, as politics come and go, as even nations come and go, Christ is still on the throne, and he always will be. So let us take comfort in that fact. Let us ground ourselves in that truth and remembering that. One of the things that Nate, one of our elders, said on Sunday that I thought was so good is we have to remember that we are, before anything else, we are Christians. Before we are Republican or Democrat or independent or even, he even mentioned, even before our skin color and our culture and our family, we're Christians first. And let us remember that we have a responsibility as ambassadors of the gospel to continue to represent Christ, to live in a manner that is worthy of the gospel of Christ, as Paul encourages us to do, that those things are still true in this climate, and it doesn't change. Now, when certain situations like this arise, different times of the political climate or what's happening in our world may cause us to need to have different kinds of responses, right? Like in wartime, you have to speak with wartime language. But at the same time, it doesn't change the fact that our first mission, first and foremost, as followers of Jesus Christ, is to go and make disciples. Our goal is not first and foremost to convince people of our political opinion. It is to first go and make disciples. At the same time, that does not cancel our responsibility to speak truth even into the area of politics. So some Christians will look at a situation like this and they'll say, well, we just need to preach the gospel and we don't need to worry about all this political stuff. Well, the gospel actually can have implications for the biblical truth has implications in politics, right? As Christians, if we're really going to be people of the truth and people who speak with grace and truth in all things, then we have to do that in the political sphere as well. We can't shy away from speaking truth because we don't want to be divisive. So we have to be careful of that. We have to be careful in all of our calls for unity and all of our calls for Christians to just remember that Christ is on the throne and to keep preaching the gospel. That doesn't negate the responsibility that we may have to speak into the political arena at times, or to speak on the current political climate, to speak with truth and with grace, seasoned with salt, right? So yes, let the words of our mouth and the meditations of our heart be pleasing to the Lord. But Jesus and Paul and the apostles and many Christians throughout the centuries have spoken really hard truths even to political leaders at times. And so we have to be willing to do that even in the midst of times like this. We have to be willing to call out evil when we see it. We have to be willing to praise good when we see it. That's what love does. So we think that to be loving in a time like this is to just not cause any division. Well, Jesus said that he came not to bring peace, but a sword, because the truth divides. And so while we don't intentionally seek to divide, when we speak the truth as we should, it will divide at times. So we have to understand that a big part of the division that's happening in our country, a big part of the division that's happening really anywhere in the world, is a division of light and darkness. It's a division of people who love the truth and people who hate the truth. That's a big thing that's at play here. And that goes into another thought that I had, is that we have to remember that before we're in any kind of political battle, we're in a spiritual battle. Let us not frame let us not frame this conversation as though this is primarily a political battle of Republican versus Democrat, or however you want to frame that. Let us remember that we fight not against flesh and blood, but we fight against the rulers and the principalities and the spiritual forces of darkness that are at work in our world. So our enemy is not a political opponent. Our enemy is Satan and his demons. Our enemy is the darkness. Our enemy is sin. And so we have to remember that, and we have to fight against those enemies in this sphere, in this arena. So I think that what I'm trying to get at overall with a lot of these thoughts is, as Christians, we've got to balance something here. We've got to balance the fact that we are Christians first. Before we are members of a political party, before we are even members of a family or whatever, we are Christians first. And the thing we have to balance that with is that doesn't mean that we get to stick our head in the sand on political issues. We should have the courage, the discernment, the wisdom, and the boldness to speak truth and grace even into a heated political climate. And not to speak grace and truth to try to sway people to our political side, but to speak grace and truth so that we first are promoters of and preachers of the gospel. And secondly, that we are promoters of and preachers of and advocates for a biblical worldview, that we are trying to persuade people. So I don't want to persuade people to agree with my political position. I want to persuade people to see life, to see politics, to see all of these things through a biblical worldview. I do want to convince people to do that. Now, the truth of the matter is, as I do that, people are going to accuse me of being political at times, right? So let me use an example. You want to speak into the issue of abortion as a Christian? You're going to be accused of being political. You're going to be, as a Christian who thinks biblically about abortion and recognizes that it is murder, and speaks in that way, you're going to be accused of being a right-wing bigot, right? So we can't avoid being accused of these things, but let us check our hearts first and ask myself, am I trying to be political here? Am I trying to be faithful to Christ? So again, we're balancing this idea that we're Christians first, and we're not members of a political party first, but at the same time, we can't separate ourselves from the reality of the world that we live in, from the reality of the country that we live in, from the reality of the importance of politics, from the reality that a situation like an attempted assassination on a former president and a presidential candidate is a very serious thing, and something that we should all be disturbed by, that we should all condemn, right? No matter what side of the aisle you fall on. So we have to be people of the truth in all things. We have to be Christians first, people of the truth, people who have a biblical worldview, even in the area of politics, who are unashamed to speak even into the area of politics, because we want to be people who love what is evil, hate what is good, and preach the gospel and seek to make disciples. I hope that I'm making sense. I know that this may be a little bit more of a ramble than some of my other podcast episodes, but these are just some of my thoughts as a pastor. I try to avoid getting really deep and specific into particular political conversations and issues on a podcast like this, because I much rather have conversations about those kind of nuanced discussions. But I think there are some things that we have to be very, very clear on as Christians. And these are some of those, that we're Christians first, that Christ is still on his throne, but that doesn't take away our responsibility to even in times like this, speak truth and life and grace into even the political arena. That when we have conversations with our neighbors and family and friends about this around the dinner tables, that we don't find ourselves promoting hateful speech, that we don't find ourselves speaking in memes, right? And what I mean by that is, a lot of people's response to this is to post funny or even derogatory images and memes on the internet, and that's how they respond to this. As Christians, we're called to a higher standard than that. We're called to have discernment and wisdom, to have our speech be seasoned with salt, but at the same time, we are called to speak. Don't neglect your responsibility and your call to speak. That doesn't mean you have to get on your social media platform or start a podcast or get up in the middle of your church service and say these things from a platform like that. But it does mean that the people that God places in your life, and when you have these conversations, that you have the courage and the boldness and the love to speak what is true in the midst of this, and to speak it with gentleness and respect, and to bring all of these things back to the gospel, to be able to have a political conversation that you speak and you act and you think with a biblical worldview in those conversations, and your goal is to bring it back to the gospel. Your goal is not to sway people politically, but your goal is to make disciples. So I hope that's helpful. That is I title these episodes usually after I record them, so I'm still thinking through a title. Maybe I'll title it A Pastor's Ramblings on Politics, or something like that. I don't know. I'll come up with a title. Maybe you already know it as you hear me saying this, but I hope it's helpful. If you have questions on this, because this is a short episode, there's a lot more I would love to say. There's a lot more I could say on the specific situation of the attempted assassination. There's a lot of thoughts we can have on this. If you're struggling with this, if you got questions, if you're wrestling through this, send that my way. Text me if you got my number, or email me at kennyroberts@missionwaychurch.org. I'd love to help you think through this, because that's my goal in this episode. My goal is to just speak as a pastor to people who live in who are living in this reality and trying to wrestle through this. I was challenged by a podcast. Part of the reason I did this episode is because I was listening to another podcast that reminded me that as a pastor, whether I like it or not, I do have people in my congregation and people in my life who will look to me and my response at times like this. And so that's part of the reason why I did that. And I hope that it was encouraging and helpful and challenging all at the same time. So thanks for spending a few minutes listening to my ramblings. This is what you get when I don't write notes. So be thankful that I do write notes most of the time. I do plan on doing that for the next episode, so don't worry that this is not going to be the norm going forward. But thanks for giving me a few minutes of your time. I pray that was helpful, as I said, and I hopefully, Lord willing, will be back next week with another episode of Hold Fast. God bless.